Good evening. I'm Jim Zirin. This is The Digital Age. Tonight's show is about internet freedom and how it might affect our relationship with China. In China, more than 420 million people use the internet, and that number is soaring. Will this inevitably lead China to a more open society and to an embrace of democratic values? Or will the net simply be a mechanism whereby the government can crack down on dissidents and stifle dissent? Here to discuss these issues with us is an old China hand. He is Ian Bremmer, the founder and president of the Eurasia Group, and we're delighted, Ian, to have you with us. Now, recently, we had a summit meeting between Hu Jintao and President Obama in Washington. What do you see as, what's your sense of what came out of that?
Well, it's the most important summit that has been hosted by the United States in at least 2 decades. The two most important economic and political players in the world today. Enormous amount of advanced planning tried to ensure that it went as well as possible by the Americans and the Chinese. Obama's trip to China, of course, did not go so well. I would say virtually nothing happened. And virtually nothing happened. That was probably the best possible outcome, which does sort of lead you to think about the underlying challenges of this relationship that are clearly growing.
Well, Donald Trump has said that China is trying to do us in. Do you agree with that? What should be our policy toward China? Should we be confrontational, or should we try to engage them?
Well, it's the first time I've responded to a quote by Trump on international affairs.
Well, he's looming more prominently on the political scene.
God forbid. And nothing against Trump. It's the Trump and political scene that is worrying. In terms of U.S. relations with China, it's very clear that the old way of doing business, we invest, we give them technology, and they give us market share. And that's worked for 30 years. That really is breaking down. The technology that the Chinese increasingly want from us is incredibly sophisticated and is close to the bone. It's, really giving away the family secrets, right? There won't be much left if they're provided. And also, the willingness of Chinese corporations to provide market share when they're becoming increasingly competitive in China, using support from the Chinese government, and even becoming competitive in export markets with Western multinationals, means that the single biggest lobby that has always supported a great relationship with China in the U.S., the big industrials and the banks, that's really not there anymore. And it's really causing a lot of underlying conflict structurally, and it's causing the relationship to become much more politicized. I don't think the Chinese are trying to do us in. I think that when the financial crisis happened, they saw that reliance on the West, and particularly the United States in terms of their exports, in terms of buying lots of treasuries, that probably wasn't as smart of a move for them long term to ensure the growth and therefore the political stability of China. And so as a consequence, the Chinese started to hedge, and with hedging comes decoupling, and with decoupling comes more economic conflict. And so what's happening is that a relationship that was really win-win from the perspective of both countries, though perhaps not with equal split of the pie, over the last 30 years, is becoming increasingly zero-sum. And that zero-sumness is going to lead people like, yes, Trump, but also people like Mr. Imelt, not to mention, sort of our friends at Google and all the rest, to believe that China is much more of a threat to American growth.
Well, do you think that we try too much to exaggerate their strengths? Because certainly the business community talks about doing business in China, and at the same time we demonize their flaws. That's perhaps the Trump line. And so we're kind of gyrating between containment and engagement of China.
Well, China is, as of now, the world's second largest economy. We saw those numbers come out, exceeding Japan in 2010. They are the world's largest carbon emitter. They are the world's largest consumer of oil. They are also per capita about $4,000 and $500 per year. That's what they make. That means that while China is a very powerful country, they are also a very poor country. And that's very different from all of the countries that have been determining how the world is to be run economically over the last several decades. That causes a real challenge. I think there is some demonization, but frankly, at the margins at this point. And I think that there is some China's in charge. I mean, you know, when you ask Americans who they think the world's largest economy is, in polls, they come back and say China. China's not even close. Of course, they used to say Japan back when Japan was the primary threat. But clearly the Obama administration is overwhelmingly trying to keep this relationship on an even keel. And even Congress, and you saw some politicization in the run-up to midterm elections, but they've backed off on trying to beat the Chinese on currency and that sort of thing because they know it's not very effective. But underlying all of that are these big structural forces that are bringing the world's two largest economies towards competition and conflict. And that is a world that you and I have never lived in. The Soviet Union, the US had a lot of conflict, but economically the Soviet Union was kind of irrelevant. That was a security fight. Well, the new security is economics. And when economics start becoming zero-sum between the two largest players in the world, that will have knock-on effects for you and me.
Well, we don't want to make them enemies a la Trump, do we? But can we ever really be close friends with China? We have such different values.
It's very hard. Close friends, given how different the values are, going to be much tougher. This is not going to be a special relationship with the kind of trust and transparency that the United States and Britain have historically enjoyed. But you do want the Chinese to see it as in their interests to invest in the United States. And we just went through this financial crisis, and probably the most well-known book that came out of it was by Andrew Ross Sorkin, great guy, Too Big to Fail. Of course, he was talking about American banks. What we need is for the Chinese to perceive the United States and the U.S. economy as too big to fail, that we are so competitive, that our fiscal condition is so strong, that the dollar is such a good bet that they want to invest here, that they want to be in treasuries, they want to have a piece of our multinationals. Now, they do want to send their kids to our universities, and that's a great thing. But that by itself isn't going to cut it if they want to go back to China for jobs, or more importantly, over the long term, if they no longer believe in the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency, which they increasingly don't. We've seen the reaction of the U.S. government, Democrats, Republicans, President Obama, in putting our fiscal house in order right now. We see what the U.S. has not done in terms of really tweaking the educational system, competitiveness, the things that the U.S. needs so that over the long term China will look at the U.S. and say, that is an economy we want to hitch our star to. You'll still have challenges with China. They're not going to be our buddies, but that would put us in the best possible position.
The history of the economic relationship has been that we buy their goods and they buy our debt. Yeah. I mean, much the same way as doing business with Cisco.
That's right.
However, they want to move more toward a consumer economy and export less. And if they do that, will they stop buying our debt?
Well, they don't believe that we're going to be capable of buying their goods the way we used to. And they
can't afford it.
They're probably right.
Yeah.
And we'd be in better condition if we could show them that long term we're doing the things that will make us more capable of having a very robust economy. The Chinese do want to move towards their own consumption. That's natural. So again, structurally, we are heading for more conflict. The question is, how much more conflict? What can we do to mitigate that? We recognize the problems, but don't we want to fix them? The Chinese right now consume about 38%. Consumption is about 38% of their total economy. In the U.S., it's about 70%. Clearly, Chinese consumption is going to go up. Per capita income in China is $4,500 roughly, but in Shanghai, it's $14,000. And in Shanghai, those people are consuming like they're wealthier. They're not just stuffing their money under mattresses. And so the Chinese will start to consume as they continue to become wealthier. They will be less dependent on the U.S. The question is how much. They will invest in a much more diversified way towards the euro, into gold, into hard commodities, into their own economy. But still, I mean, the euro doesn't look like such a great bet versus the United States dollar right now. From our perspective, we should want that to continue to be the case.
The finance minister, the Chinese finance minister, said that he doesn't think the dollar should be the world's reserve currency. I don't know whether he was suggesting that the yuan, he was suggesting special drawing rights, which are a basket of currencies. And of course, this is something that the United States is vigorously opposed to.
That's right. And yet the United States clearly understands, whether it's the head of the World Bank, Bob Zoellick, who's a very capable fellow, or whether it's the Obama administration, they know that the ability of the U.S. dollar to have the same influence as the world's reserve currency is coming under attack. And that attack is not a big bomb. That attack is a death by 1,000 cuts as everyone around the world starts really diminishing and hedging away from where they're putting their money. That's why gold prices are so high right now. We see what's happening with global commodity prices, and part of that is indeed stockpiling. We see what's happening with direct bilateral agreements between the Chinese and the Brazilians to denominate themselves as opposed to going through dollars. I'm sure this is going to start happening with petrodollars as well, becoming a basket of currencies. That advantage, that intrinsic advantage that the U.S. has enjoyed for decades is eroding, and it's eroding in front of our eyes.
But if not the dollar, what? That's really the question. I mean, if you're going to replace the dollar, you're not going to replace it with the Chinese currency. The Chinese would have to make a lot of economic moves before they could make that happen, particularly revaluation, which they don't want to do.
The dollar's not going to be replaced by anything. The dollar's going to be replaced by everything. Right? It's not going to be one currency.
So you ascribe to the basket of currencies view as the world's reserve currency?
I don't ascribe to it. I just think that's where we're moving. I'm not suggesting it's a good idea. But, you know, again, when I talk about the fact that the G20 is really being replaced by a G0, where there's an absence of global governance and global leadership, that's happening on standards, it's happening on climate, it's happening on trade, it's happening on currency. And in the absence of a new Bretton Woods agreement, that is what you are moving toward.
And moving toward protectionism. I think you said protectionism is alive and well in your recent Foreign Affairs article.
There's a greater degree of protectionism, and you know,
Paulie Smoot, 1930. We're rolling the clock
let's
back.
hope we're not doing that.
Yeah.
And keep in mind that in the United States, labor's been destroyed. The important lobby in the U.S. is still the corporate lobby, and the corporate lobby generally likes free trade. But the corporate lobby, which has been behind supporting openness with China for decades, is increasingly not, because they see that they actually have real problems with their ability to continue to make money and do business the way they have. We talk about a level playing field. The Chinese talk about win-win. But the reality is that the sharing of profits between the U.S. and China is going to change dramatically. You know, in Europe right now, they're talking about rebalancing in Europe. And it's an honest conversation, because they've gotten to the crisis point, and now someone has to pay the bills. It's going to be the German and French taxpayer, or it's going to be on the back of the quality of life and standard of living and social support for the Greeks, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, and the rest.
So the Germans, who were all for a Eurozone and all for a united economic zone, and now, because of the influence of the German people and German politics, they're pulling away from that. They say they don't want to support the Greeks and the Irish. And
no one wants to pay the money, of course. I mean, and there's a lot of posturing happening so that the Greeks will pick up more. But the point is, it's a zero-sum conversation. Someone's going to pay more, someone's going to pay less. Everyone understands the rules of the game. That rebalancing is also happening in front of our eyes between the U.S. and China, between the West and the developing world, but we're not admitting it. We're talking about win-win. We're talking about level playing field, yet in reality, there is a bill that is going to be paid, and the Americans are going to have to pick up more of it than they want to.
Let's go to human rights and go back to China,
Sure.
if we can. In the summit, of course, Hu Jintao at the press conference said that China had a lot more to do in the area of human rights. We know about at least 3 shocking cases. Liu Xiaobo, who was the empty chair at the Nobel Prize, 11 years in jail. We have the Panchen Lama, who was arrested at age 6. He's now 21 after 15 years. He's still in jail. Zhen Guangzhang, a political activist. He and his wife were under house arrest, and they were both beaten. What should the U.S. posture be? Are we making any progress in these areas?
Well, our leverage has gone down. I mean, you know, Hillary Clinton said it very wisely. You know, it's hard to criticize your banker. When you have limited leverage, your ability to tell other countries that they should be adhering to your values. I mean, look, we don't have a spotless record on human rights, and the Chinese are quick to point that out. Our record on human rights is vastly better than China's is. But our ability to tell the Chinese, you should do X, Y, and Z, after 2 years after the financial crisis, when we need China more than ever, and they're the economy that's growing like Topsy, that's a challenge for us.
As their finance minister said at the time of the global financial crisis, I see that the teacher is having some problems, so rather sarcastically.
Well, and you know, I actually, my last book, The End of the Free Market, I opened it up because I had this meeting with the former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he opens up the conversation sitting across the table from me, and he asked, he said, so Ian, now that the free market has failed, what do you think the appropriate role of the state in the economy is? Look, I don't think the free market has failed. I don't think the fact that some corporations were able to capture the state on a regulatory policy, on finance, for example, or even in oil drilling, means that the free market's failed. It means that corporate CEOs who don't support a free market were able to run rampant with short-term profiteering and compensation. That's not good, but that doesn't imply that China's model is better. Right? And so for the United States, we really need to go back to the things that made America work, some of which we still have. We've got great, you know, sort of high-level education, universities, and beyond. We've got a lot of research and development that is dollars that are put into very interesting new technologies. We have extraordinary entrepreneurship in this country that we support. But there are a lot of other things that are really undermining our competitiveness. And they're going to hurt us over the long term, and yet politically we don't seem to be able to get beyond this continual electoral cycle.
What about the deals that were made at the summit? Do they undermine our competitiveness? I mean, Boeing sells them technology and builds plants there. I guess they're American jobs in the short run. But won't that technology eventually be appropriated by the Chinese, and it will create Chinese jobs and not American jobs?
Well, this is a really tough question, because there's no doubt that when Boeing goes over and provides a lot of technology to China, the Chinese reverse engineer their 737. And over the long term, Boeing's going to have a real tough time in the commercial aviation market. You're already seeing that with high-speed rail. French technology, German technology, Japanese technology, and you know, those companies now are competing with Arnold Schwarzenegger, going over to China and saying these trains look really good. Well, they should, because they've got the world's best technology and a lot cheaper from other countries that have been providing it. That's a problem, and the Chinese are very, very capable of playing Western companies off against each other. If Boeing doesn't want to help with certain parts of the plane, then China will cut a better deal with GE. American corporations, their weakness is that they're fundamentally more short-term. They've got shareholders, they have to report earnings every quarter, they've got executive compensation that these guys want to get paid out. They don't know if they're going to be there in 5 years. And they also are looking over their shoulder at other companies that are doing the same thing. Now, as China becomes more powerful, the need of the United States to have, I hate to use the word, but a more directed and pro-business industrial policy that helps the U.S. to ensure a more strategic and long-term vision is going to become very important.
Deng Xiaoping, more than 2 decades ago, said that his strategy for China was bide and hide. They should bide their time. Now it appears their strategy is our time is now. Now, are you arguing that America's strategy should be bide and hide? We should take a leaf from Deng Xiaoping's book?
Look, I think we need to be more strategic. There's no question, because otherwise we're not going to be doing any business with these guys long term. It's not going to be effective. But we should also note that as globalization proceeds, one thing that the Chinese are importing from the U.S. is the fact that they have to be increasingly responsive to their own domestic constituencies. And frankly, over time, that means China's ability to be strategic will be undermined. China's ability to do 5-year plans and to move villages to make way for dams or for sort of high-speed rail or what have you will itself be constrained. So,
infrastructure.
Yeah, China's not going to have the same easy time of it in terms of making their own domestic decisions that they've enjoyed over the last decades.
Now let's shift, if we may, to internet democracy.
Sure.
With the increased use of the internet in China, does that mean a more open society inevitably, and that China will embrace democratic values and become closer to us?
Well, it means that what the Chinese people want will become increasingly public, and others will be less able to ignore it. Now, is what the Chinese people want democracy is an open question. I mean, there's kind of a myth out there that when you have the internet, it's democratizing. And the reason we believe that is because all of the people that got the internet early on were first in the advanced industrial democracies where there is a propensity to support liberal democracy, and also elites, cutting-edge elites in emerging markets who were sort of bought into the whole Western-led globalization theme. Now that you've got hundreds of millions of Chinese on the internet, what you will get as they make their voices heard is what they want. And it is not at all clear that what they want is liberal democracy. What they want, I think more than anything, is to continue to grow economically. And I suspect you're going to see an awful lot of nationalism, especially because the American narrative and the Chinese narrative is so very different. We're telling them you have to be careful about climate change because if you industrialize at this pace, it's going to be bad for everyone. And they look at America and they say, well, you guys industrialized. We want to industrialize. And we're saying we want to have rule of law and transparency so that we can do business the way we used to. And they look at us and they say, well...
And less corruption.
Yeah, and they look at us and they say, well, with that old business, your corporations expatriated 90% of the profits. Now we want our corporations to make money. I mean, it's like Israel and Palestine. If you listen to them, they both make really good points. They both feel it very directly. If you give them both the internet, they're going to say that very loudly. But giving the Israelis and the Palestinians the internet isn't going to create peace. It's just going to make it much more obvious where the fault lines are.
Well, they have armed forces of 3.4 million. And do you believe that with greater economic success, they'll become more belligerent and more nationalistic?
I think that the military has become more assertive in China. There's no question. I mean, they see comparative American weakness in the region, and they want to know that if they push a little bit, you know, what's the new reality? Can they push Japan off of their alliance with the U.S.? What about South Korea? What about countries like Singapore, Indonesia? They've definitely been pressuring. But China overwhelmingly wants stability in the region, and they want stability to allow themselves to grow. Their priority is China. If they don't continue to grow at a very fast clip, if they don't keep inflation under control, if they don't keep unemployment down, they're going to have a direct threat to the legitimacy of their regime because that growth is what legitimizes them.
How about testing a fighter jet during Secretary Gates' visit to China? I mean, there's a certain arrogance they exhibit on the world stage that perhaps provokes people like Donald Trump.
You know, I thought it was very interesting that they did test this, they buzzed this new stealth fighter while the Secretary of Defense was in China. There is a policy of certainly, you know, sort of muscle flexing to show that China's building up their military capacity. I doubt very seriously that it was planned while Hu Jintao was actually hosting the Secretary of Defense. That embarrasses Hu Jintao. It's a loss of face. It made him look bad. He was surprised. I suspect that there were people that were fired as a consequence of the fact that that wasn't thought through.
It's reminiscent of Eisenhower sending Gary Powers and the U-2 over Russia at the time of a summit meeting with Khrushchev.
For me, it was reminiscent of Netanyahu inviting Vice President Biden for dinner and at the same time having one of the Israeli ministers announce that they were going to expand settlements in the West Bank. That clearly was Netanyahu's policy. The timing was embarrassing. That guy was sacked. The difference here is that in China, we're not going to know what they do to how they clean house with their own military internally, because they don't air their laundry that way.
By the way, do you think that the Chinese government will use the net as a way of cracking down on dissidents?
Well, they do that.
Locating them?
They do that very effectively. I mean, one of the problems that Egypt had, the Egyptian government had, I should say, the old Egyptian president, Mubarak, is that when things got ropey with folks on social networking, they did not have the capacity to monitor and actually go after individual dissidents and ringleaders. So what could they do? They didn't have a scalpel, they had a sledgehammer. So what they did was they basically shut down the entire internet. In China, they're not going to shut down the internet. They're going to monitor everyone that's a problem. Gmail accounts through Google, for example, and when they see someone doing something they don't like, they go and they arrest that person.
Well, I'm afraid we have to wrap up, but this has been a fascinating conversation.
Happy to be with you, Jim.
So Ian Bremmer, thank you so much for coming by. And I have a question for you. Will the net be an instrumentality for a more open society in China, or a means of cracking down on dissidents?
It's both, without any question. It'll continue to be both for quite some time.
Both for quite some time. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming by, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. For the Digital Age, I'm Jim Zirin. Please go to our website at digitalage.org.